What's up, Internet? It's been a while. I wish I had a better excuse for why, but what can I say? My interest in RTS games ebbs and flows like anything else, and for quite a while it's ebbed a lot more than it's flowed. The lackluster launch of Age of Empires 4 took a lot of the wind out of my sails, and the fact that YouTube changed its monetization rules in a way that meant I no longer qualified didn't exactly help. If you're still waiting for a My Thoughts on Age of Empires 4 type video, you'll probably be waiting a while yet. To be honest, I just don't have a full video's worth of stuff to say about it, aside from the fact that I wish they'd finished it before they released it. I haven't played it since 2021, and I'd have to play at least another 10 or 15 hours before making a video, so I'm basically waiting for the moment when I actually feel like doing that, which unfortunately isn't right now. There are, however, a number of games on the horizon that I am interested in following and hopefully covering. Zero Space, Immortal Gates of Pyre, Tempest Rising, and of course, Stormgate, which for the record I haven't played yet myself. I bought into the next beta phase on the Kickstarter, but the original beta sign-up happened when I wasn't really paying attention to RTS games, so I missed out. Anyway, despite the title, this video is, in a sense, not actually about Stormgate, at least not directly, and that's because this video is more than 2 years old. I wrote the script and recorded the audio for it around the time I posted my last video on War Pips, before we knew anything concrete about Stormgate, and then just kinda never got around to finishing it. It's about the interaction between setting and gameplay, and how Frost Giant might want to approach deciding on a setting for their game, which is technically a moot point now that Stormgate has been officially revealed. But even though some of it is now kinda pointless speculation, I figured you might find the lion's share of it to be interesting food for thought anyway, so I'm posting it now without any alterations. What's up, Internet? HarvestBuildDestroy here, and in this video I'm once again going to talk about the upcoming Frost Giant game. As the title suggests, I'm going to be discussing some of the myriad ways an RTS game's setting can affect its gameplay, and how I think Frost Giant ought to approach deciding on a setting for theirs. On the surface, setting would seem to be a mere aesthetic choice, and of course aesthetics certainly is an important variable to consider when deciding on a setting, but it's much more complicated than just that. A game's setting places certain restrictions on its content that can have pretty significant implications on its gameplay, to such an extent that I think it makes just as much sense to reverse engineer a game setting based on gameplay requirements as it does to start with the setting and design the gameplay around it. Perhaps the most basic example of this, which ripples out and affects every other element of a game's design, is how a clearly defined setting determines what types of units a game can feature. This is pretty difficult to pin down to an exact rule, as everything tends to hinge on the specifics of the game in question, but I'll give you an example and hopefully you'll get the idea. Let's say you want to design a game with a semi-realistic pre-gunpowder historical setting like Age of Empires 1, 2, or 4. Based on this setting, you're probably going to have a higher percentage of melee units with swords and axes and so on as opposed to ranged units, and air units will basically be out of the question. This fact alone will have a pretty profound effect on the directions you ought to take your game's various other mechanics, assuming that your end goal is to create a game whose moving pieces fit together to form a coherent whole. Armchair speculative though this may be, I think the set of restrictions your setting places on your unit set will in turn place other restrictions on, or at least suggest the directions you ought to take other things like economy, map design, and defender's advantage, to name a few. As I alluded to before, how this will manifest in a particular game can easily hinge on the properties of specific units or how they interact with any number of other mechanics that may or may not be unique to that game, and this makes it difficult to make any broad declarations about how a particular factor determined by setting will ripple out and affect other elements of a game's design. This massive pool of different codependent variables is constantly in flux, but you can alter any of them as you see fit if they don't produce your desired result. This is what Frost Giant mean when they bring up the idea of iteration. You come up with an idea, test it out, and if it doesn't produce your desired result, tweak it and test it again, rinse, repeat until you get what you want. This is obviously an expensive and time-consuming process, but that's what all the Riot money's for, right? Anyway, let's take StarCraft as an example. Although you could, in theory, design a sci-fi universe centered more around melee units if you really wanted to, sci-fi games will tend to feature almost entirely ranged units and plenty of air units like we see in StarCraft. StarCraft units also have 100% accuracy unless you're firing uphill, and splash damage is relatively common. This type of unit set can obliterate groups of fragile workers quickly, so it makes a lot of sense to design the maps around choke points, making it relatively easy to keep units out of your base. A typical StarCraft map has an easily defensible ramp leading up to each of its bases, which are otherwise blocked off by impassable terrain. Since the maps are so choke point oriented, it also makes a lot of sense for the game's inherent defender's advantage to be fairly low. That is, the ratio of unit DPS to building health. And if defenses are going to be concentrated around choke points, it makes sense that buildings wouldn't be very tanky, such that you can actually break through with a marginal material advantage. Air units, which can bypass terrain, synergize well here, as they give you a way of diverting your opponent away from choke points or even sidestepping them entirely. Similarly, limiting the number of locations you have to defend by concentrating resource collection into specific areas of the map makes a lot of sense here too, as does the very nature of Vespene gas collection. The fact that you only have 3 workers per geyser limits the overall number of workers per base and makes it easier to set your economy back up after an attack. This limits how much damage can be dealt in one fell swoop, which is important since the game is otherwise somewhat volatile. Although it's certainly not the only factor, the unit set that is so strongly influenced by setting is at least a factor which synergizes with all of these other design choices to form a coherent whole. That is, a dynamic metagame where players have a wide range of strategic options at their disposal. If for whatever reason the interactions between your game's various mechanics did not produce your desired result, you could, within the internal logic of the setting, alter your unit set or the properties of specific units in order to produce whatever your desired result was, and the same is true for any other mechanic. The key is that all of these different mechanics should work in tandem like they do in StarCraft, Age of Empires, and the various other RTS games that have stood the test of time. The number of different ways this could be achieved is probably infinite. Like I said, there are too many variables to define any particularly concrete rules about this, but a clearly defined setting does at least rein in some of these variables. Every setting will have its own unique internal logic, and perhaps most importantly, its own degree of obligation toward realism, which is especially important for games with historical settings. And of course, unit set isn't the only variable that setting will place restrictions on, it's just one of the more obvious ones. I think we could say something similar about economy. As the StarCraft example hopefully demonstrates, a game's unit set can certainly suggest directions for economy design, but the setting itself can also place restrictions on it. To put it simply, you have to work with the resources that actually make sense within that setting. To return to the example of a semi-realistic pre-gunpowder historical setting, this probably means that you have things like food, wood, and various precious metals like gold, stone, and iron to work with, and we've seen this time and again. You're also restricted to having these resources be used for things that actually make sense within that setting. For example, it would be a bit strange to have workers cost iron or stone, just like it would be odd for buildings to cost food. There's still a fair bit of wiggle room here, of course, but once you've clearly defined your game's setting, your gameplay options aren't quite as wide as they at first seemed. However, there are countless different ways you can define your setting, each with its own unique set of restrictions. With the semi-realistic pre-gunpowder historical setting, even a slight alteration to any aspect of this will fundamentally alter the set of gameplay restrictions it applies to the game. For instance, nudging the game's historical timeline a century or two this way or that could change everything depending on the century in question. I went with the more general pre-gunpowder as opposed to medieval or antiquity with this example because I think the advent of gunpowder is one of the key moments in history that would fundamentally alter the parameters of an RTS game designed around that era, since you'd naturally end up with a lot more ranged units. We could probably say the same thing about the advent of the airplane, which would of course make air units fair game. Similarly, if we were to nix the semi-realistic part and opt for a more cartoony aesthetic like that found in Age of Empires Online, for example, we would have much more creative license with just about every aspect of the gameplay. If we weren't quite as bound by realism, we could probably get away with including a larger proportion of archer and catapult type units and deviate from the melee-centric unit set that might be expected out of a more realistic historical game set in the same era. However, if we still wanted it to loosely fall under the category of historical rather than fantasy, there would presumably be a limit to this somewhere. But whether or not we should want the game to be historical as opposed to fantasy is ultimately a matter of vision. This choice can be made for either aesthetic or gameplay reasons, both of which are perfectly valid ways to approach designing a game as far as I'm concerned. Let's say you're leaning toward a less realistic, more cartoony historical game set in the Stone Age, but after you start developing the gameplay, you realize that your game could benefit from the inclusion of air units. At this point, you might want to consider shifting your setting more in the direction of fantasy so you can make use of flying dinosaurs like Pterodactyl or Archaeopteryx. But again, whether or not you'd actually want to do this would depend on your vision. If you were inspired to design the game because you were enamored with the idea of a cartoony historical RTS on an aesthetic level, probably not. In that case, you'd have to design the gameplay around the restrictions your setting imposed. But if your initial inspiration was that you wanted to create a certain type of game in terms of gameplay, you'd be better off molding your setting to fit that. This is what I meant when I said that you could just as easily reverse engineer a setting as start with one and base your gameplay around it. As for Frost Giant, based on their stated core values and all the things I've heard them say in interviews so far, I suspect that the reverse engineering method will be the way to go. They've mostly discussed what they're experimenting with in terms of gameplay and don't seem at all committed to any particular setting. The assumption for most players is that they'll go with either fantasy or sci-fi like Blizzard, but they seem open to all possibilities. When asked precisely this question, fantasy or sci-fi, on the Pylon show, CEO Tim Morton said, "I actually think there should be more options on that list. Are fantasy and sci-fi the only things we can choose? Let us know, because this is a very active subject for us." Despite his having said this, I still suspect that fantasy and sci-fi are the most likely candidates because their entirely fictitious nature allows for greater creative license in terms of gameplay, which appears to be their primary concern. When you aren't as bound by realism, you can just sort of make up whatever you want. Instead of being more or less obligated to have a resource like wood be used to construct buildings, you can just choose something vague like minerals, or make something up entirely like Vespian gas, and just have those resources be used for whatever makes sense for your game in terms of gameplay. As I said before, you have a lot less wiggle room with an historical setting, since you'll need to pay at least a basic degree of lip service to realism. This means your gameplay options will necessarily be more limited, so historical settings are generally speaking unlikely to be arrived at via the reverse engineering method. If you're making an historical game, the setting is probably going to be your starting point. As such, this category of setting is the one I think it makes the most sense to rule out as a possibility for Frostgiant's game. However, when I say I think fantasy and sci-fi are the most likely candidates, I mean this in the broadest sense possible. When we say fantasy or sci-fi, we generally mean something quite specific. Tolkien-esque medieval high fantasy with orcs and elves and so on, or aliens and lasers sci-fi a la Star Wars or Alien vs. Predator. Technically, both categories are a lot broader than this, and if we rule out historical and modern day settings, arguably everything that remains falls under one or the other, or even both. For instance, we tend to think of steampunk as its own genre, but really it's just retro-futuristic science fiction. That is, science fiction centered around the kinds of technologies people in earlier eras supposed would exist in the future. This type of setting may or may not make use of magic, or science so out there it might as well be magic, so we could perhaps describe them as sci-fi fantasy hybrids in some cases. Basically, at a certain point, it's just semantics. Perhaps a better way of putting it is to say that I suspect that whatever setting they end up going with won't be one that entails a particularly strong obligation toward realism in order to maximize gameplay malleability. The tried and true Tolkien-esque fantasy and aliens and lasers sci-fi are certainly options, but as Tim Morton says, they aren't or shouldn't be the only ones. As you might have guessed by now, I suspect that the desired proportion of melee versus ranged units, as well as the choice of whether or not to include air units, will be among the most important factors in making this decision. Personally, I'm less concerned with the setting itself than I am with the internal coherence between its gameplay and its aesthetic properties, particularly its art style. As game director Tim Campbell said on the Pylon show, subject matter is not necessarily the same as art style. Amen. Orcs, aliens, steampunk, cowboys, dinosaurs, tomato, tomato. The important thing is to cross the uncanny valley, so to speak. Make the game look the way it feels to play. I think this is at least a decent part of what we mean when we say a game has that ineffable quality charm, and it's something that pretty much all of the game's major titles do very well. StarCraft 2's somewhat cartoonier art style pairs excellently with its lightning-fast gameplay and arcade-like castable abilities, where armies can evaporate in a moment. On the other hand, Brood War's grittier aesthetic, particularly with the remastered graphics, is a perfect match for its sprawling battles and difficult-to-break entrenched positions. As an historical game, Age of Empires 2 pays a basic degree of lip service to realism, but only up to a certain point, and its art style's tasteful hint of cartoonishness reflects this. We've all seen the memes: 10 elephants fit in a transport, 11 archers don't, whack a stone building with a sword and it sets on fire, hit the ground beside it with a hammer and the fire goes out. It's not realistic, but that level of realism would get in the way of it being a good video game. So regardless of the specific subject matter they pick, I hope Frostgiant will be mindful to toe this line. A game's visuals and sound should serve to complement its gameplay. There's nothing wrong with cartoony graphics or arcadey gameplay, but the two ought to line up. The best example of a game that does this badly that I can think of is Warcraft 3 Reforged. If this didn't already go without saying, I am of course specifically referring to the Reforged graphics. Warcraft 3's original graphics are vibrant and cartoony, just like the game itself. It features a plethora of castable spells with arcade-like effects that need to be visually intelligible at a glance, which the original graphics are. But with the Reforged graphics, it seems like they've tried, unsuccessfully, to find a happy medium between the original art style and that of darker fantasy games like Dota 2 or Diablo. It has a dingy, murky sort of look to it that is completely at odds with Warcraft 3's gameplay. Basically, the point is, the interlocking web of design choices should encompass not only gameplay, but art and sound design too. This should most likely come after the gameplay, but it's nonetheless an important part of making the game feel right. I'm personally hoping they'll place particular emphasis on the unit voices. The cheeky dialogue you get out of units in StarCraft, Warcraft, and Company of Heroes are, in my view, a non-trivial part of what makes them such a joy to revisit, and I hope Frostgiant will aim for this sort of thing with their own game. Anyway, that's just about all for this video. Thanks for watching, and if you would take the time to massage my algorithm by liking, subscribing, hitting the bell, and so on, I would greatly appreciate it.